Our luncheon panel on the topic of trades and apprenticeship harmonization in Canada. During the panel, feel free, as I mentioned, to get coffee. I'm just going to ask you to try to keep those table discussions, those sidebar conversations to a minimum, all right? So I'm going to now invite the panelists to come to the stage, including the moderator, Ray Massey, who's chair of the Alberta Apprenticeship and Industry Training. Gentlemen.
You one for Ray? Okay.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. As chair of CAF, I can tell you it's a definite pleasure to be here to introduce our panelists today. Panel on harmonization, some of the harmonization efforts that are going on across Canada. There has been an increased public attention on apprenticeship and the skilled trade shortages over the last several months, especially with the concerns of some of the skill gaps, the mismatches, and our aging population. There are some projects underway by the governments and industry to examine how we can bring some greater consistency, especially with concerns about the skills gaps that I mentioned earlier. The certification standards, trying to harmonize some of those, the regulatory issues that we're trying to harmonize those. We're going to have some pretty interesting presentations today to help inform you as to what's going on across this country. To start off, I'd like to introduce Mark Douglas, who is the Executive Director of Policy Standards, Apprenticeship and Industry Training in Alberta. Mark is also the Vice Chair of the Canadian Council of Directors of Apprenticeship, better known as CCDA. CCDA is also the administrator of the Red Seal program. Mark is also the chair of the CCDA's Committee on Foreign Qualification Recognition. I know Mark well, very well exactly, because I also chair the Alberta Apprenticeship and Industry Training Board. Mark is going to be talking to us about some of CCDA's activities, also be talking about some of the activities going on in BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan under the New West Partnership Agreement, and also be enlightening us as to what's going on in Atlantic Canada. Secondly, we have Fraser Cox, who is with us. He's the Executive Director of the British Columbia Association of Crane Safety and Chair of the Canadian Hoisting and Rigging Council, known as CHRSC. The CHRSC is a national organization established to work towards harmonization of applicable credentials and recognition requirements across this country for the crane industry. Fraser will speak about some of the work that is underway through the CRSC to create a database requirement for the crane trades to inform discussions and harmonization and other related projects. And finally, we have my friend Dave Suess, who will come to us and talk to us and give us a little bit of an employer's perspective on harmonization. But before we get to that panel, I'd like to share a little bit more about him. Dave is an advisor at Suncor, who is responsible for the development and the implementation of a strategic apprenticeship program for Suncor's North American projects. Dave is a CAF board member and a former CAF chair. Dave is also a member of the first Board of Governors for the Ontario College of Trades and is a founding chair of the Hamilton Skilled Trades Apprenticeship Consortium. So as you can tell, we have a bunch of experts up here to talk about some of the activities that are going on, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you after you hear their presentations. Hopefully they're formative thinking enough that you're going to really want to just jump up to those mics and we can have an informed discussion. So with that, we're going to try to keep the comments concise and to the point so we have lots of time for those questions. And I'd like to kick off by inviting my Executive Director, Mark Douglas, to come up and share what's going on with CCTA, Western Canada and Atlantic Canada.
Thank you, Ray. I got to remember to, where did my clicker go? Okay. I believe that the stakeholders represented here today share a common interest with the CCDA in developing highly competent and mobile skilled trades workforce. This is critical to Canada's long-term economic success. There are three initiatives that are often brought together under the notion of harmonization. Those are the Atlantic Workforce Partnership on Harmonization and Apprenticeship, CCDA, or the Canadian Council of Directors Harmonization Initiative, and the New West Partnership Initiative. It's important to note that harmonization is not a problem, it's a solution. Harmonization is a good thing, but it's important to recognize that we all have our own version of perfect harmony. With that, I think it's important to look at the problems that some of these initiatives attempt to address. I've categorized the problems harmonization attempts to solve into the three items there: systemic efficiencies and effectiveness, labor mobility, and consistency. They're not absolutes, and no one problem is the singular focus of any one of the initiatives. Efficiencies kind of, in my mind, refer to things like shared IT platforms, common program development, increased offerings in small trades, or where more than one jurisdiction can offer the same thing. Effectiveness, I think of things like alignment of programming so that it eases the transition from one program to another if an apprentice is moving from one jurisdiction to another. Labor mobility is about the barriers that actually prevent people from working in one jurisdiction or another. And consistency, well, I guess just because it would be nice if we were all the same. Anyway, the Atlantic Initiative will increase systemic efficiencies through a reduction in duplication and development costs by creating common regional approach to apprenticeship. This common approach will mean greater mobility and stronger labor force supporting the region's economy. The initiative plans to harmonize many elements of apprenticeship, including trade names, number of required hours, curriculum standards, and sequencing, a common bilingual digital logbook, and one Atlantic advisory committee per trade, as well as the completion requirements in each trade. In addition to the work being done to align these trades, other supports for apprenticeship will include building common information technology platforms. And I'm sure most of us have stumbled across at one point or another. IT systems are expensive, and there's a certain amount of economy when we share in that work. There are advantages to syncing curriculum in that it provides more opportunities for apprentices to attend technical training. Trades under review in the first 24 months of the Atlantic Initiative are the bricklayer, instrument control technician, cook, and construction electrician. An additional 6 trades are being confirmed as we speak. Atlantic premiers signed a memorandum of understanding just last week on May 26th to establish common training, certification, and standards to help apprentices complete training and work within the region more easily. So on to the CCDA. The CCDA Harmonization Initiative began by examining a number of issues that appear to be different from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. Those included things like sequencing of technical training, required on-the-job and in-class hours, occupational scope, and whether trades were compulsory or voluntary. The focus is on 10 trades in this particular initiative: carpenter, mobile crane operator hydraulic, heavy-duty equipment technician, metal fabricator, fitter, welder, ironworker generalist, ironworker structural ornamental, and ironworker reinforcing. Following the analysis of the existing apprenticeship training certification requirements in these trades, recommendations were to focus on some things that we thought were doable, and those were trade names, curriculum sequencing, and the training hours. So we've tried to narrow our focus. The initial focus will be on sequencing in the carpenter trade. We also discovered that we probably need to do some things around the categorizations in the mobile crane. And that was a bit of an anomaly too. I think I'm going to let Fraser talk about that. This work was aimed at improving the effectiveness of technical training transition between apprentices moving from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. So if you start your program in one jurisdiction, it should be easier to pick it up in another jurisdiction. Although most jurisdictions currently have a means to facilitate the transition of apprentices between jurisdictions, some stakeholders have indicated that there may be challenges for some apprentices moving between particular jurisdictions and particular trades. CCDA aims to identify common expectations, recognizing that some flexibility may be needed regarding implementation to meet local industry needs and respective jurisdictional priorities. The New West Partnership Initiative is focused on labor mobility, and it's pretty young, so its focus might change too. While there may be some efficiency benefits in particular targeted areas, the underlying goal is that an apprentice should be able to live, work, and go to school in any one of the 3 Western provinces. The focus is on labor mobility and removing barriers to mobility. Among the 3 jurisdictions, there are a few issues related to labor mobility in that there are a few restrictions preventing an apprentice registered in one province from earning work experience credits in the other province. There are established processes for apprentices transitioning from one province to the other. Jurisdictions are working together to identify and provide specific mobility barriers that prevent apprentices from working or going to school in the province of their choice, whether they are moving temporarily or permanently. Jurisdictions may also look at ways to make training more efficient in low or perhaps high volume trades by providing better access to each other's programming. The 3 initiatives are different but complementary. The Atlantic and CCDA initiatives have, for example, focused on different trades to maximize the learnings between projects. The New West Partnership effort will also make every effort not to duplicate the work undertaken by the Atlantic and CCDA initiatives. Although the CCDA can make recommendations for jurisdictions to consider, the CCDA as a collective doesn't have authority to force jurisdictional change. The CCDA Harmonization Initiative is an attempt to facilitate common expectations for apprenticeship training and certification requirements so that they may be adopted by any one of the apprenticeship authorities. It's up to the industry at the local level to influence the provincial territorial adoption. It's the individual jurisdictions that make the changes through the statutes and processes associated with their individual CCDA member. This process allows the migration to an interprovincial standard, but respects the responsibility of the provinces and territories. It allows jurisdictions to move according to jurisdictional industry priorities. In the case of the Atlantic and the Northwest initiatives, the direction was provided by government in the regional clusters described. Could this happen on a excuse me, from a pan-Canadian perspective? Perhaps. But the more people that have to agree on the complex and diverse issues with competing reasons and rationale, the more challenging it can be. I'm sure you can appreciate how the regional issues related to program efficiency and labor mobility may change our individual priorities. The bottom line is that while the 3 initiatives are different, they're complementary and will help improve the apprenticeship system overall. Thank you.
Thanks, Mike. And perhaps now we can hear from Fraser.
Do you want me to?
Yes, well, wherever you're most comfortable.
Okay. See which button here. Oh, okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity. Thank you to the CCDA for asking me to be a part of this panel. The crane industry, and great, Alan, it's hard to ignore the fact that you're getting this award, and I wanted to basically speak to that publicly and the influence you've had on myself and the various projects that we are actually working with today, which I'm going to try to cover, but I want everybody here to know that Alan has had his hand in this for probably most of the duration of the trip. So, the crane industry has seen a lot of different issues and the different challenges, and I know this is an apprenticeship forum, but ours reaches not just, we obviously plug into that program, but this reaches far beyond just that. It's also into the regulatory issues that we are challenged with. So we've got all these provinces and territories. We've allowed them to do business on their own and create what they think is best for their industry groups, and they've done just that. But the outcome of that is that they are different, and in our industry, can be quite different, even so far as how you define a crane type and how big it might be in a category and so forth. So the industry itself is changing. Mobility is different today than it was even 10 years ago, even 5 years ago. And this industry being, I guess, in relation to other trades, compare us to carpenters, electricians, and plumbers, we're relatively small in number. And that gives us some advantages in the sense that we're able to talk and pull together as a group. And that's kind of what this initiative has been about. And it's been a story, an ever-evolving story about, which started with British Columbia, moved over into Alberta because we were two jurisdictions crossing the borders regularly, and there were issues as a result of that. So as my travels have gone into this, I've gotten to learn more about what these differences are. And when I was working with the Alberta side of the picture, it was like we were talking about issues, realizing there were barriers. What could we do about that? And part of it was even just to have the conversation was the starting point. So this whole initiative, this council being formed, is driven from a conversation, essentially, a conference that going back about 3 years ago, a panel just like this, talking about this initiative, the issues that this industry was facing, and what we should be doing about it. And the outcome of that being, if we don't pull together as an industry, we're probably going to be continuing to fight or struggle through whatever these issues and challenges are. So, coming together as one voice is the one way that this can be resolved, and the only way as far as we see it. So I represent the owners of the industry itself. The operating engineers are highly involved in this as representing the operator side of the picture. And we've been meeting now and formed about a year and a half officially to move this issue forward. So harmonization, the CCDA's embarked upon, the timing couldn't be better for our industry. I actually met with a gentleman this morning who's here from Montreal. He drove up the 2 hours to get here just to meet with us and to be a part of what this initiative is. So no matter what jurisdiction I've been touching, the issues are the same. So it may be unique to us, but as I'm hearing different people in this room talk during the conference so far, I think the challenges are the same. We may have some unique issues, but this industry, for one, is going to do something about it. And that's what we're moving forward to do. So these are the jurisdictions that we've engaged officially with. And as I said, we're having conversations. So it started in the west, and it's moving to the east. And so far, I'm not seeing any pushback from industry in any way, shape, or form. We met on Thursday in Calgary as our council, and we had 3 people from Ontario actually fly out to be at the meeting. So that demonstrates that this is real, and they're serious, and they're committed to do this. And these are the owners of the companies that are doing this. This isn't just some other association doing something. So that's kind of the picture of what we've got. And Part of what happens with industry as well, though, you have to have some projects. Of course, and these are some of the other stakeholders that we've engaged with, because it goes out above and beyond just jurisdictional elements and just apprenticeship bodies, of course. So, industry needs something to chew on. You can't just throw an idea out there and they'll say, oh, that's great, that's interesting. You have to have something real and tangible. So we embarked on a number of initiatives. So the first one is, of course, working with the CCDA on this project. So we're in with both feet. We want to see this go where we want it to go, and we'll be that one voice to speak to whatever that is, and hopefully come to that one outcome. We also have a project where it's calling it a multi-jurisdictional crane operator regulation, but what this essentially is we're mapping the current state of the affairs in the country. So if you're a crane operator in Newfoundland and you want to work in Alberta, are you okay to go? Is your credential recognized? If not, why not? And who to speak to? So this is what this tool is going to do, and allow that to be, you need to know what your starting point is in the lay of the land. The third one there is the demonstration of skills test. Highly regulated crane or industry, we have a theory exam, which is great and wonderful, but not all jurisdictions have a practical in place. We want to see that consistent, offered across the country, and we want it to be the same exam. So we see the need and the fit also for this to work with the CCDA and taking our trade to the next level. In this work, working with a project group, the Asia Pacific Skills Table, they're here today as well. It's a partnership that we've established, and they're basically received the funding and are doing the work to support us through this project. And lastly is rigging. Rigging, as I travel, and I've seen a lot of this country, as well as in the United States, seems to be an issue that's kind of flying low under the radar, but is really important to this industry. And there's a lack of standards, there's a lack of rules around that. It touches a lot of trades. We're all doing something, but we don't even know what that looks like. So we're going to attempt to fix that. And we're working with the Standards Council of Canada as a starting point, and like our other initiative, they've mapped out the regulatory requirements and standards that are currently in place in Canada. And I'll tell you right now, it is a dog's breakfast. No one has the same references or regs in place. So again, as an industry, we've come together. That's what our mandate is. That's what this council is about. It's a voluntary position and or role. We're doing this on the sides of our desks, and we're seeing great traction, and it seems to be what industry needs to have done going forward. So, thank you.
Great, thanks, Fraser. And maybe Dave, you can share and give us the employer's perspective on this.
Thank you. Okay, which button? Okay, so I've had when I approached this, when I was asked to do this, it was around from the employer's perspective, and I started getting into certain stories. I've had the distinct opportunity of working in 2 different jurisdictions, 2 different sectors, trying to address this with the industry, within the industry, labor, government, and education, and multi-stakeholder events. Improvement initiatives with the CCDA. And I started to realize is everybody in here actually probably has a view on some of on these perspectives. And I think, so I narrowed it down to one slide because they told me I only had about 8 minutes. And I'm just going to talk around a couple of bullets on that slide in a matter of perspective. And I think that's the first part, is everybody in here, I think, depending on your experience, the experience of your own child as an apprentice, yourself as an apprentice or a journey person, and what you do within this, the skilled trades and trades development, you probably all have a different opinion or view of it. And they're all important. I think a lot of them are coming through to the CCDA and these harmonization of initiatives on the East and West Coast as well. I think the typical one is around labor mobility and as a barrier to apprentice mobility. And like as I said, it's a complex conversation, and even since I've been here this week, I've had two additional perspectives shared with me. One is the idea of the co-op diploma student in one jurisdiction who actually is able to obtain their work experience in another jurisdiction. It may count till their post-secondary diploma, but it may not count towards their apprenticeship because of the recognition of the hours and where you serve your time. So again, we talk about pathways and opportunities. And building on, I think, what we've just heard around crane certification and rigging, of more of the approach being a top-down as a very specific sector. I know Dan Taddick with the Canadian Welding Association, we had a conversation last night, and they're investing as the Canadian Welding Bureau is investing over $1 million in a common training curriculum and testing approach for welders, which if anybody knows the welding trade in detail, it is not an easy trade because one thing is the red seal, the rest of it is how do you demonstrate competency around all your other certification requirements. So again, I think we've got a couple of examples here of where harmonization is actually not your core trade, but those certifications over and above your core trade as well. From the matter of perspective on the finance, cost, and rigor to maintaining 13 different training curriculum standards for the same trade. I mean, it is bottom up. Every jurisdiction has advisory committees, and they roll up, and we try and influence the red seal, and this is why we end up with variations. But again, it's to all of us. I think it's a cost from a provincial government perspective and from the red seal at the federal level, trying to maintain it. And I think to build on the financial costs is also the recruitment cycle times and validating eligibility. From a recruitment perspective, and I'll speak to that here a bit when I get down to recruiters, is trying to, you're trying to fill a need as quickly as possible, but you still need to validate when you're going, especially going from one jurisdiction to another, what that is. And of course, there's the common training and competency validation tools that are needed to allow for the jurisdictional variances, and yet still provide for a national standard of competence. From the communication and education perspective, again, and building on that perspective, new apprentices, when you come to trying to explain this and to a new apprentice, whether they be youth, unemployed, underemployed, or new Canadians, public, the parents, the educators, and specifically the recruiters, as far as people that are charged with, I know I spoke with one of the people that asked a question this morning earlier around DES recruitment, and it's around trying to get your recruitment staff to even understand how to be able to look at a resume and differentiate between the naming conventions. We always talk about the pre-certification apprentices. So there's the training and certification requirements, the technical training, number of hours, levels required, the alignment of those levels in terms of sequencing of the curriculum, the on-the-job work experience, again, number of hours, and the recognition of the hours worked and where. As far as compulsory and voluntary designation is not consistent as well. As we look through our inter-jurisdictional our 13 jurisdictional programs and approaches. From post-certification, again, the common naming comes in, and an example is a millwright, an industrial millwright, a construction millwright, and an industrial mechanic. I mean, if you just look at that one skill set, it's a matter of, okay, just wanted to make sure we're okay. It's a matter of looking at, that one skill set, and depending where you are and where the people are applying from and what certification they have, is just how that impacts your ability to fill your needs. And I think probably the last thing to speak of is, as far as leading into, I think, a good interactive conversation here, is the need for labor mobility versus time required to remove the barriers to mobility through harmonization. So we're putting a lot of energy, a lot of money, resources into trying to clean this up. I mean, it took us, I think the Red Seal's been around for 60 years, just over 60 years. It took us a long time to get us here. And my concern is, and we start hearing about 2-year projects and that, and we're dealing with this many trades, from a personal perspective is, some of this we need now, we need it sooner, and I know it takes time, but I think it builds on what Mark shared with us this morning about how do we take our hats off and what's good for the industry, what's good for the trades, and the apprentices in this country and the youth as far as getting them into employment and quickly implement and figure out how to approach implementing these common harmonized approaches so we can make this a lot easier to understand, and maybe youth will, and those others that are available will consider employment in the skilled trades. Thank you. Step on you.
Well, we've heard 3 presentations about some of the activities going on in this country in regards to harmonization. The one thing that I do know is I've heard from industry for years and years and years now that we should be harmonizing our efforts as it relates to apprenticeship. But you know, it's interesting when we started actually getting into the meat of this and we actually started to work on it, all the different layers of this onion and all the different issues that we end up coming across and having to address as we move through it. Whether it's regulatory, whether we're talking about language, it's amazing some of the stumbling blocks that we've been running into. And it was also quite significant. I sit on CCDA's Harmonization Committee, and we're taking a look at those 10 trades right now, and we look at the significant differences that exist as we go across this country as it relates to particular trades. Some of it is really quite surprising. So anyhow, with that, when we started this project, I went back to my board, and I said to my board, do you guys believe in harmonization? Everybody said yes. And I said, what does harmonization mean for you? And it meant pretty much something different for everybody as we went around the room. So today, I think there's been some really good work up to this point on harmonization. I think we're getting ourselves to a good place. But you've heard the information today. And I'm wondering if you're hearing what you wanted to hear. Is there things that these groups are not addressing that you think they should address? I would welcome people to get up to the mics, ask us some questions, see whether or not we're able to answer them. Harmonization has been an issue in this country. Is it about labor mobility? Is it about the quality of the certification? Do we have anybody that's willing to ask a question? Are we on the right track? Are we going down the wrong tracks?
Oh, I have one question.
Sure.
I've been a hairstylist for 9 years, and now I'm teaching hairstyling in high schools at Mother Teresa. Now, for me, harmonizing, it should be consistent across the country, right? For my trade, I have had an issue getting a red seal in Ontario. I do know that you can get a red seal for hairstyling in Quebec, and I seem to have forgotten it might be Alberta or Manitoba. I don't know which one. And I think BC. Now, one of my practicum teachers said that she sat on a panel 4 or 5 years ago to talk about bringing the red seal to Ontario, and she was dismayed to find out that nothing had come of that. So are there any plans on trying to make sure that the red seal is available for all trades in all provinces and territories?
Yes, and I'll turn that over to perhaps Mark, being that they're the administrators of the Red Seal program.
I'll try.
He'll find it.
It's, as I said in my presentation, the adoption of the Red Seal or the adoption of any particular CCDA product is the responsibility of the jurisdiction. For hairstylists, Alberta, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, I'm guessing, Quebec it's available, most of the Atlantic jurisdictions it's available. I know that BC has had some issue with, because there's a requirement to have a practical assessment, so BC, I don't know where they're at. At one time they delivered it. It's whether Ontario is able to provide the requirements for the Red Seal. I suspect it's probably a practical assessment requirement, but I'd have to have Ontario speak to why they're not.
And we have Dave here from the College of Trades, so.
Yeah, and actually, I do believe the College of Trades is Royden Trainer in the room. Royden, could you maybe...
So you heard that they're working on the practical, so once the practical is in place, then they will be able.
So it's, the gap is the practical, and it's being worked on. Everything else is in place. So there has been activity since that last conversation. Thank you.
So do we have any other questions? Are we going down the right track? I think that's the biggest question I would like to have answered right now.
Dennis Green from BC with our Tourism and Hospitality Association, also a cook by trade. So the question I have is where do we think the barriers are? Because I think in my trade, in my industry, I just happened to come from our national convention a couple of days ago, which was also here in Ottawa, and the discussion around the table is why is it different in every province when us as cooks, when we come together, all believe we're doing the same thing and want it to be the same in every province. And the feedback I got from my trade folks is that when they go to their provincial committee meetings and put it in front of their provincial apprenticeship boards, they get the pushback that says, oh, well, you know, you have to have all the provinces together in order for it to move forward. So I think the question is, I know it probably varies by trade in terms of where the barriers are, but is there an approach that's going to work? I know one thing I suggested to the folks, I said, what if all of us as a group went to our provincial governments at the same time and said, we all want the same thing? And would that influence the decision making? But I'd like your perspectives on where those barriers are falling.
And that's a very good question. I could likely answer it, but we have an expert panel up here, and I'll get them to answer it. So we'll start with Mark.
And I think that's essentially what the CCDA is trying to work on, is try to find what that common ground is, or that common expectation, so that provincial jurisdictions can then work to that common expectation. I mean, it's a work in progress right now, but that's generally how CCDA products are developed, is to find out what the consensus is around a particular thing and then work back with individual jurisdictions to make it a reality in each jurisdiction.
So the other two panelists, anything to share on this?
Well, that's exactly what the crane industry is doing. We've come together as the industry, and that's to have that one voice. If you've got one voice, it's pretty hard to ignore. Versus if you've got two or three differences going on, it's just noise. It's like politics. As long as there's noise, change is very difficult to see occur. Versus one message across the country, this is what it looks like, this is what it is going to be, we'll get there.
Dave?
Well, and I mentioned about a top-down and a bottom-up approach. I mean, traditionally, the scope of practices and the trades have been created from the bottom up because it's industry-driven. Mm-hmm. And the reality is this is where we've ended up today. Do we have, I'll speak to the Ontario model, I think it's 155, 157 skilled trades. Is there really that many different trades in this jurisdiction when you look at what some of the others have? So there's a lot of opportunity here, but from the bottom-up approach of being industry-driven, we've ended up with this. And the reality is what we're asking, or what we're seeing, is the fact that we need to change it, which is that whole stakeholder engagement, collaboration, all those things we keep talking about. That's what takes the time, as opposed to much like what Fraser's doing, and what we're hearing with the welding is to say, we're going to get together as a national committee and we're going to work on this and we're going to try and influence it that way. So I guess it's a different approach.
And you do need a champion. Somebody has to take the ball and get this started. Yeah. Otherwise, it's just talk and it has no legs.
Right. And I think the effort that CCDA is involved right now is developing that framework that can be subscribed to by the various jurisdictions across the country, rather than being political and being driven from the political pulpit, if you would. Industry gets behind the initiative, supports the initiatives, and they're all able to buy into it and support it and move together in uniformity. This morning's presentation was on collaboration, and from my experience through my involvement with CCDA, that's a model of collaboration that seems to work quite well. It's not always easy to kind of work your way through it, But I do think that they're able to put those frameworks, those agreements in place, and slowly but surely get everybody to support them and get on board. So it's a bit of a process in a country as diverse as Canada is, and I don't know that we're going to ever have the jurisdiction give up the responsibility for certain parts, some of the areas of jurisdictional responsibilities that they have, i.e. education, health, and whatnot. But together and through collaboration, we can get to a place that we can all support industry-led initiatives such as harmonization. Yes?
Bob Davis, Federation of Post-Secondary Educators in British Columbia.
Yeah, Bob.
The idea of harmonization, I think, is a good one, but the more we delve into it, the more questions are going to be asked. And I think that what's important is to make sure that all the stakeholders are involved in that process, and that as decisions come forward, that they're validated as right for the jurisdiction. There is a responsibility provincially to administer the red seal if it's applicable for the credential that's being offered. But really the question is around autonomy and who has the authority to make that decision. Are our jurisdictions willing to give up some of that autonomy in order to have a harmonized system? It is mobility when you become qualified. So I think one of the questions that I have for the panel is how much mobility will the harmonization create in the year 1, 2, and 3, and 4 of an apprenticeship? Because is that the issue we're trying to resolve here? Because we do have mobility as a red seal, and I've always been amazed, and I've told many people here, I'm amazed that we actually have a red seal, and to get it that much cooperation across the country. I'm extremely proud of my red seal in millwright, and I often acknowledge myself as a red seal millwright before anything else. So my question for the panel is really how much and how realistic is that mobility before journeyman certification is really viable?
Good question. Which one of the panelists, I don't want to pick, which one of the panelists want to kick us off on this?
Well, I can speak to some elements of it. I mean, Alberta has had I think it's been posted on our website for the last 10 or 15 years that regardless of what jurisdiction you come from as an apprentice, you'll get full credit for whatever period, wherever you left off in your previous jurisdiction when you come to Alberta. I mean, yeah, sure, there's some bumps moving from one program of technical instruction in one jurisdiction to another one in Alberta. And the example I always use is I went to grade 4 in Saskatchewan. They didn't make me start over again. I had some trouble with long division, but I had a good instructor and they actually let me back into Alberta when I was done. But I think there's ways to overcome it. Will it happen tomorrow? How big are the issues, I guess, is something I'd like to know, because I don't want to solve a small problem at a huge expense. I'd like to solve the big problems that, if I have to put big expenses in play. We do have a lot of apprentices in Alberta that actually go to school and take their training and get certified in another jurisdiction and earn their work experience in Alberta. I mean, there are a variety of things that happen. I know that happens. I'm more familiar with the West, but I know that happens to some degree in BC and Saskatchewan as well.
I was going to say the same. I know I've met an apprentice who's doing his education in BC. He's working in northern Alberta. That's where his work is taking place, and he commutes. That's one of the drivers in terms of my industry. The airport is your method of commuting. And that's what I was meaning by mobility has changed. So in these bigger projects are going to be the same. We're all going to be traveling by airport because it's a 2 or 3 hour trip, and you're where you need to be to work. And you may be coming from Newfoundland, or you may be coming from British Columbia to go to Alberta, or vice versa. But those are the elements that are driving a lot of this, and we have run into the fact that the credential itself isn't always recognized. And you know, I know we've got these different agreements in place, but sometimes it's the people on the ground, they haven't seen a credential before, and they question it, and they put the brakes on this activity.
And to build on that, I think, is it the question about how much mobility will it create as much as how much mobility it will support? And we talk about completion, you know, when you're in Ontario, you're in your second year of your apprenticeship, and your job comes to an end. Something happens, you're laid off, but there's work in another part of the country. And I mean, the ability to go there and have those hours count to complete, it's not a matter of going there and living there for the rest of your life, but at least you're filling the need in a different jurisdiction. Your hours count. Where you end up after that, I think we heard from the panel this morning on the construction sector, as far as they rely on mobility and the ability to be mobile and have your hours in your trade school count is important to supporting that overall completion. So I think from my perspective, I look at it, is it supporting completion, or we'll go farther to support completion and keeping those that pursue a career in the skilled trades in the trades to completion.
You have something else, Mark? So I guess what we're hearing there is that for a lot of jurisdictions, the labor mobility piece really isn't the big issue. I think they're identifying other issues as common language, some of the efficiencies through the processes and registering and administering the programs could definitely be helpful. But mobility is a certain issue with certain provinces, especially as it relates to some of the regulations that's been established in the jurisdictions. So it takes a while to move through those provinces, but it's not the same across the country when it comes to labor mobility. Dave?
Well, just before you go to the speaker, what I was going to say, Ray, is the reality is, and we said I started out saying we weren't going to get into specific stories. When you have a fourth-year apprentice in a trade in one province, and for whatever reason they end up out of work, and there's an opportunity to go to another province, but you're going to be counted as a third-year apprentice and paid as a third-year apprentice, the whole motivation comes into effect. Is it in it for me to move? I mean, I can stay here on EI for up to, you know, for my period and take a chance, and or I can find another job, as opposed to having to go backwards.
Absolutely.
So that's another example.
Yeah. So I think we have time for one more question. Ken?
Ken Erica, Suess Lacey. Mark, can you explain long-handed division to the younger people in the room?
Is that serious or having fun here?
No, that's
Wake up after lunch.
That was the part I missed, Ken.
Okay, I'm going to try to wrap a comment, challenge, and question all into one ball, and the three of you, I think, you can flip a coin who wants to answer it. You talk about industry challenging you and the needs and meeting them. Now, when you're talking about the harmonization of the programs, the educational programs, we know it won't be ready for the 214, 215 intake. Do you see it being ready for the 215, 216 intake? If not, when?
So I think that's yours, Mark.
At this point, we're talking on the CCDA initiative. We're talking about the carpenter program, and we're talking about sequencing curriculum in a common way. I'm not even sure what that common way is. If it's Alberta's way, we'll be ready tomorrow. We're already there, but I don't know what the resolve is. I don't know what that common way is. I think, speaking to one of the other gentlemen's questions here, if we decide, and this is the challenge that I have, if we decide that it's not the way it is in Alberta, that I have to turn all the curriculum inside out, there's a cost to that. And I guess that it may take longer to do it if it's a costly thing. But sight unseen, I can't give you an answer, Ken. I just don't know how I get there without.
And there's certain components of it that might be a little bit easier than others, such as the common language piece. Dave?
Well, and I guess, and again, building on what Mark shared with us this morning, and Ken, you're right, it's one thing to decide what the change is going to be, to have a harmonized system across this country. It's another thing to how do we implement it, and implement it with some expediency so we can actually benefit from it. So I guess what concerns me, and we'll probably continue this a little later on, is, so, you know, we're hearing what Alberta's saying, and the reality is, if it is really a national harmonized approach, it should really be easy to implement because you only have to build it once and you share it across 13. I mean, when you think about it, there may be some regulation change, like it depends how you implement, but the reality is if everybody built 3 or 4, there's 13 jurisdictions, and it quickly could ramp up to implementation. But we need to decide the what before we can get to the how, and that's the slow piece, I think.
I think we do have an advantage in that we have essentially 3 different initiatives, and we're very conscious of not duplicating each other's work, so that we'll be able to move on 3 different fronts. I don't know whether that helps in that sense or not, but until we see what harmony is, it's hard to make an implementation plan on how to get there.
Fraser?
Yeah. Our industry, we're taking probably a proactive approach, and maybe we'll be aggressive, but we have to realize that, like, I know the BC story, I know how BC works, how that process functions. I know a bit more about Alberta because they're a neighbor jurisdiction. I know less as I go east. And each system functions in its own way. And so you need people from that jurisdiction that understand how that works so that they can influence change when the time comes and how that looks. And it was actually said by one of the fellows at the meeting on Thursday was, we're the consistent ones here. We're the industry. Government will change, apprenticeship will change, we're not gonna. So we know where we want to go. How long that's going to take, it's going to take what it's going to take, but at least we know what we want to see.
Give a follow-up, Ken?
Yeah, just a comment. Just wanted to express the urgency and that we can't sit around and talk much longer. We have to enact.
No, and duly noted, and I think the one thing that I think that I'm really encouraged about is we're finally having the dialogue. We've talked about it for years, and in the last couple of years, we're actually moving on it. So I think there's some encouraging signs, but I know some of these initiatives do not move at glacial speed. So I do sense from industry that there's a sense of urgency here. We have all those labor challenges coming at us. This is part of the puzzle, I guess, in trying to address some of those issues. And Cliff, you'll be short and sweet because I got to end this.
Yeah, I just want to say from the Atlantic Canada perspective, was I'm, I guess, one of the lead people on from Newfoundland and Labrador on the Atlantic Harmonization. And, one of the things is that I think just for those in the room that are not quite familiar with all the processes and everything that takes place, all I say is that right now, if we all left here and we had a set destination somewhere in Ontario that we were all going to go to, we probably wouldn't all choose the same road. But the fact is, we got 13 roads right now that leads from the beginning point to the same destination. What the harmonization has to do is get us all on the same road, which we know that's when you bring in lots of regulations and a lot of legislation and all these things that come into play, then it can be cumbersome and it can take some time. But I agree with you, Ray, that one of the things we did right from the get-go in Atlantic Canada is why, and Mark referenced it about the memorandum of understanding that we got signed from the 4 Atlantic premiers, because I thought that was an integral part of us moving forward, because governments change. They change, and if the government changes, so can the plan. So, but this is not a project. This is something that has been sustained for the next 20, 30 plus years. So it's got to be something that has something beyond it. So I'll just say that, and I agree that we're having the conversation. We'll concentrate on what I call the low-hanging fruit first, and that may be Howers, and maybe some of those things that where we can get some commonality, and then move into the more complex things along the road that we'll hopefully pick off one by one. So again, going back to a date, I think we'll, there's some things that hopefully we'll see probably within a year that will make some more sense to all of this. But other things might take 5 years to get there. So again, just from that perspective, I think we're on the right road, and I think we'll get there.
Thanks, Cliff. Good point to end on. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your involvement in the discussion on harmonization. Thank our panelists for what I think was a very excellent mind and provocative thinking. and got us to a good place here this afternoon. So I would encourage you as the conference unfolds here that if you have any issues or just want to talk to us or flesh this out a little bit more, come see us. Come see these three gentlemen in particular. And with that, we'll take a bit of a break and we'll reconvene at 1:30 in our breakout sessions.
Okay, thank you.